These movies weren't just controversial, they were so extreme that governments tried to erase them. What kind of film makes police raid theaters? Critics demand bans, and censors panic across entire countries? In the dark corners of Grindhouse cinema, a handful of filmmakers pushed violence, taboo, and shock so far that the rulebook simply collapsed. Tonight, we're uncovering 15 movies so outrageous they broke the censorship system itself. And one of them was so disturbing. Authorities believed it might contain a real crime. I Spit on Your Grave, 1978. When this film first appeared in Grindhouse theaters, many viewers didn't even know what they were about to see. The posters promised revenge, the title sounded ugly and confrontational, but nothing prepared audiences, or censors, for how brutally the story would unfold. Directed by Mir Zarki, I Spit on Your Grave follows Jennifer Hills, a writer who retreats to a remote cabin to finish a novel. The isolation feels peaceful at first. Quiet woods, empty roads, a place where no one is watching. That silence doesn't last. Soon, a group of local men begin circling her property, turning curiosity into harassment. What follows becomes one of the most controversial sequences in exploitation cinema. An extended assault scene that many critics argued crossed a line no film should approach. When the film finally shifts direction, it transforms into something else entirely. Jennifer begins hunting the men responsible, one by one, delivering slow, calculated revenge that made audiences gasp in theaters. The violence is personal, methodical, and disturbingly quiet. Censorship boards reacted immediately. The film was banned outright in several countries, condemned by major critics, and labeled vile and unwatchable in newspaper editorials. In Britain, it later became one of the infamous video nasties targeted by authorities during the 1980s moral panic. But controversy kept the film alive. Despite censorship attempts, underground screenings and midnight showings turned it into a legend of Grindhouse cinema. Proof that sometimes the movie's censors try hardest to bury become the ones audiences refuse to forget. And on this list, things only get more dangerous. Cannibal Holocaust, 1980. When Italian director Ruggero Deodato released Cannibal Holocaust, authorities didn't just try to censor the movie. They tried to charge the director with murder. The film presents itself as recovered documentary footage discovered after a group of American filmmakers vanish while exploring the Amazon rainforest. At first, investigators believed the crew was documenting remote tribes. Then, they watch the footage. What they see becomes increasingly disturbing. Violence, cruelty, and a level of realism that felt almost impossible for audiences in 1980 to process. The movie's raw, handheld style made the horrors feel authentic. Actors looked genuinely terrified. Scenes appeared unscripted. The chaos felt real, too real. Italian courts briefly seized the film, convinced that some of the killings shown on screen might be genuine. Deodato was forced to produce his actors in court to prove they were still alive. Even after that, bans spread rapidly. More than 50 countries restricted or censored the movie at various points, and animal cruelty scenes triggered further outrage from critics and activists. But the scandal also created a strange legacy. Cannibal Holocaust would later be recognized as one of the earliest examples of the found footage style that modern horror films would adopt decades later. What began as a Grindhouse shock film ended up influencing an entire genre. Still, many countries refused to screen it for years, because once audiences saw it, they couldn't forget the feeling that what they were watching might not be fiction at all. The Last House on the Left, 1972. Before Wes Craven became famous for directing A Nightmare on Elm Street, he made a film so disturbing that theaters struggled to keep it on their screens. The Last House on the Left didn't look like a traditional horror movie. It looked almost documentary-like. Raw lighting, uncomfortable silence, and performances that felt unpolished in a way that made everything seem more real. The story begins with two teenage girls traveling into the city for a concert. Their trip takes a terrifying turn when they encounter a group of violent criminals led by a sadistic fugitive named Krug. What follows is grim, relentless, and deeply unsettling. Instead of stylized horror, Craven presents brutality with a stark, almost clinical approach. The violence unfolds slowly, forcing the audience to confront what's happening, rather than hiding it behind cinematic tricks. Critics were furious. Many theaters refused to screen the film. Others demanded cuts before agreeing to show it. In several countries, the movie was banned outright for decades. Even the marketing campaign acknowledged the film's disturbing reputation. Posters famously warned viewers to avoid fainting, keep repeating, "It's only a movie, only a movie, only a movie." But censorship attempts didn't stop audiences from seeking it out. The film developed a reputation as one of the most shocking Grindhouse releases ever made, launching Wes Craven's career while simultaneously igniting debates about how far horror films should be allowed to go. And compared to what's coming next, this controversy was only the beginning. Elsa, She-Wolf of the SS, 1975. Few Grindhouse films pushed boundaries as aggressively as Elsa, She-Wolf of the SS. Released in 1975, the movie immediately triggered outrage for its setting alone. The story takes place inside a fictional Nazi prison camp, where a ruthless commandant named Elsa conducts cruel experiments on prisoners. The premise was intentionally provocative. Grindhouse producers understood that mixing exploitation cinema with imagery connected to World War II would generate instant controversy, and that's exactly what happened. The film depicts Elsa as a tyrannical authority figure who believes women are stronger than men and uses prisoners as subjects for brutal tests meant to prove her theories. From its earliest screenings, audiences were shocked by how aggressively the film blended historical imagery with sensational exploitation storytelling. Censorship boards reacted quickly. Many countries banned the film entirely, arguing that its use of Nazi symbols combined with graphic violence crossed an unacceptable line. Critics accused the filmmakers of exploiting real historical suffering purely for shock value. Even in regions where it was not officially banned, theaters often refused to screen it due to public backlash. Yet the controversy had an unexpected effect. Instead of disappearing, Elsa, a She-Wolf of the SS, became a Grindhouse legend. Midnight theaters, bootleg VHS tapes, and underground screenings kept the film circulating for decades. For exploitation cinema fans, the movie represented something almost mythic, an example of how far filmmakers would go to shock audiences. And somehow, the films ahead of it would push censorship even further. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974. At first glance, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre seems like a straightforward horror film. A group of young travelers pick up a strange hitchhiker while driving through rural Texas. Their road trip leads them to an abandoned farmhouse, and eventually to a nearby house occupied by a deeply unsettling family. But what audiences experienced in theaters in 1974 felt unlike anything horror had shown before. Director Tobe Hooper created a film that looked almost documentary real. The lighting was harsh. The camera movement felt chaotic. Characters screamed in genuine panic. Viewers walked into theaters expecting entertainment. Many walked out halfway through the movie. The film's most infamous character, Leatherface, a towering killer wearing a mask stitched from human skin, became an instant symbol of horror. Yet surprisingly, the film contains very little explicit on-screen gore. The terror came from atmosphere, the screaming chainsaw, the suffocating heat. The sense that the characters had wandered into a nightmare that obeyed no rules. Censorship boards across multiple countries reacted strongly. The film was banned in several regions, including parts of Europe, where authorities argued that its intensity was psychologically harmful. In Britain, it remained unavailable in its full form for years. Ironically, attempts to suppress the movie only amplified its reputation. Over time, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre became recognized as one of the most influential horror films ever made. But at the moment of its release, many officials believed it represented something dangerous. Proof that horror had entered a new, uncontrollable era. Blood Feast, 1963. Before Blood Feast, horror movies relied on suggestion. Monsters hid in shadows. Violence happened off-screen. Filmmakers understood the limits of what audiences and censors would tolerate. Herschel Gordon Lewis decided those limits meant nothing. Released in 1963, Blood Feast introduced something rarely seen in cinema at the time. Graphic gore shown directly to the audience. Limbs, organs, and bright red blood appeared on screen with a bluntness that shocked viewers used to more restrained horror. The story itself is deceptively simple. A quiet caterer named Fuad Ramses secretly worships an ancient Egyptian goddess. To revive her, he begins murdering young women and collecting their body parts for a ritual feast. What disturbed audiences wasn't just the plot. It was how directly everything was shown. Lewis filmed the movie cheaply, using crude effects and harsh lighting. Yet that raw style made the violence feel strangely real. Instead of elegant gothic horror, viewers were confronted with messy, uncomfortable scenes that looked almost improvised. The reaction was immediate. Some theaters posted warning signs outside screenings. Others reportedly placed buckets in aisles for viewers who felt sick. Critics condemned the film as grotesque and tasteless, and censorship boards attempted to ban or heavily cut it in several regions. Yet the controversy created curiosity. Blood Feast became a Grindhouse hit and helped launch the entire gore horror subgenre that would dominate drive-ins and midnight theaters for decades. The Devils, 1971. Some controversial films provoke outrage because of violence. The Devils provoked outrage because it challenged religious authority. Directed by Ken Russell and released in 1971, the film dramatizes real events from 17th century France. The story centers on Father Urbain Grandier, a charismatic priest who becomes the target of political enemies within the Catholic Church. What begins as a theological dispute quickly spirals into hysteria. A group of nuns claims to be possessed by demons, accusing Grandier of witchcraft and corruption. Church authorities seize the opportunity, launching an investigation that soon becomes a disturbing spectacle of accusation, torture, and public humiliation. Russell filmed these events with surreal intensity. The sets were stark and theatrical, the performances explosive. Scenes of mass hysteria blurred the line between religious devotion and madness. Censors were horrified. Religious groups protested the film before many audiences even saw it. Several countries demanded cuts or refused to distribute it entirely. One sequence, often called the Rape of Christ scene, became so controversial that it was removed from many versions. For years, The Devils existed only in incomplete editions, yet its reputation kept growing. Many critics later viewed the film as a bold critique of institutional power and religious manipulation, and that interpretation made it even more uncomfortable for censors, because the most dangerous stories aren't about monsters. They're about real systems of authority. Pink Flamingos, 1972. If Grindhouse cinema had a king of deliberate shock, it was filmmaker John Waters. And Pink Flamingos, released in 1972, was his most outrageous experiment. Waters didn't simply want controversy. He proudly described the movie as an exercise in poor taste. The film follows Divine, an underground performer competing for the title of filthiest person alive. Throughout the story, Divine battles a rival couple determined to steal that title through increasingly bizarre acts of criminality and absurd behavior. The plot is intentionally chaotic. Characters run illegal schemes, commit strange crimes, and constantly attempt to outdo one another in shocking ways. The humor is grotesque, surreal, and designed to disgust respectable audiences. And it worked. Mainstream critics condemned the film almost immediately. Newspapers called it revolting and morally offensive. Some theaters refused to screen it at all. But the real controversy came from a scene near the film's end. Even today, it remains one of the most infamous moments in underground cinema history, an act so outrageous that many viewers still debate whether it should ever have been filmed. Censors struggled to categorize the movie. It wasn't traditional violence. Instead, it weaponized disgust, deliberately attacking social ideas about taste and decency. That strategy turned the film into a midnight movie legend, because sometimes being labeled the filthiest movie ever made is the best advertising possible. Faster, Pussycat, kill, kill, 1965. By the mid-1960s, exploitation filmmaker Russ Meyer had learned something about censorship. Violence might trigger bans. Explicit content might cause outrage. But dangerous women in control could make authorities just as uncomfortable. Released in 1965, Faster, Pussycat, Kill, Kill follows three go-go dancers racing through the California desert in powerful sports cars. Their leader, Varla, is fearless, aggressive, and physically intimidating, traits rarely given to female characters in cinema at the time. During a confrontation with a young couple in the desert, violence erupts. Soon, the trio discovers a remote ranch rumored to contain hidden money, guarded by a bitter old man and his sons. What follows is a strange mix of crime thriller, exploitation spectacle, and dark comedy. The women dominate every scene. They manipulate men, control situations, and operate with a level of confidence that completely reverses the gender roles typical of the era. Censors didn't quite know how to respond. The film's dialogue overflowed with innuendo. Its costumes were provocative. Its tone suggested a world where traditional moral rules no longer applied. At first, the film struggled to find mainstream acceptance, but decades later, critics began re-evaluating it as a groundbreaking cult classic, one that anticipated modern conversations about gender power long before Hollywood was ready. When it first appeared, however, many censors believed it represented something dangerous, a world where women controlled the chaos. Last Tango in Paris, 1972. Few films have triggered legal battles as intense as Last Tango in Paris. Directed by Bernardo Bertolucci and released in 1972, the film stars Marlon Brando as a grieving American living in Paris who begins an anonymous relationship with a young woman he meets in an empty apartment. From the beginning, the film aimed for emotional rawness. The characters refuse to share their names. Their relationship exists outside normal social rules, driven by impulse, grief, and complicated attraction. Bertolucci filmed their encounters with a level of intimacy that audiences had rarely seen before. For many viewers, the result was deeply unsettling. Brando's performance felt painfully personal, as though the camera captured emotions never meant to be public. Censors reacted quickly. In Italy, authorities seized the film and launched obscenity trials against the director and producers. Courts ruled that the movie violated public morality laws, ordering copies destroyed and temporarily stripping Bertolucci of his civil rights. Other countries imposed bans or demanded heavy cuts. Yet controversy only increased curiosity. Audiences lined up to see the movie governments insisted was too disturbing for theaters. Critics later debated whether the film represented daring artistic expression or exploitation disguised as art. But for censorship authorities in the early 70s, the movie represented something far more troubling: cinema exploring emotions and behavior that were becoming impossible to regulate. A Clockwork Orange, 1971. When A Clockwork Orange premiered in 1971, it didn't just provoke controversy, it triggered a national panic. Directed by Stanley Kubrick and based on Anthony Burgess's novel, the film follows Alex DeLarge, a charismatic yet deeply violent young man leading a gang of criminals through a dystopian version of Britain. Their nights are filled with robbery, destruction, and sudden bursts of brutality. Kubrick presented this world with disturbing style, bright colors, classical music, carefully choreographed violence. The contrast made the film feel hypnotic and deeply unsettling. Audiences weren't just watching crime unfold, they were watching it framed with elegance, almost like a twisted ballet. That artistic approach outraged many critics who believed the film risked glamorizing violent behavior. Then, something strange happened. In the months after its release, several real-world crimes in Britain were reportedly linked to the film by newspapers. Whether those claims were exaggerated or not, the media storm became intense. Public pressure grew rapidly. Instead of waiting for government censorship, Kubrick made an extraordinary decision. He personally requested that Warner Brothers withdraw the film from British theaters. For decades, A Clockwork Orange was essentially unavailable in the United Kingdom, despite being one of the most famous films in the world. Bootleg copies circulated quietly among fans, turning the movie into something almost mythical. Only after Kubrick's death in 1999 did the film finally return to British cinemas. By then, critics widely regarded it as a masterpiece. But during its original release, authorities feared something far more dangerous. A film that seemed to suggest violence might be impossible to control. Thriller. A Cruel Picture, 1973. Some exploitation films push boundaries. Thriller. A Cruel Picture shattered them. Released in 1973, the Swedish film follows Frigga, a young woman who is kidnapped and forced into a brutal life controlled by criminals. For years, she endures violence, humiliation, and complete isolation. But Frigga does not remain powerless. Quietly, she begins preparing for revenge. She trains herself in secret, studying firearms, practicing martial arts, and carefully observing the men who destroyed her life. When the moment finally arrives, she launches a calculated campaign of vengeance that unfolds with chilling precision. The premise alone was controversial. What truly shocked censorship boards, however, was the film's extreme realism. Director Bo Arne Vibenius refused to soften the violence or disguise its consequences, presenting scenes with a stark, uncomfortable intensity rarely seen in cinema at the time. Rumors spread that certain sequences contained unsimulated acts, claims that sparked legal scrutiny and international outrage. Authorities demanded heavy cuts before allowing the film to screen. Some countries banned it outright. Others released drastically edited versions that removed entire sections of the story. Yet the film refused to disappear. Bootleg copies circulated through underground film circles, turning Frigga, often seen wearing a black eye patch and carrying a shotgun, into an iconic symbol of revenge cinema. Decades later, filmmakers would openly cite the movie as an influence, but when it first appeared, many censors believed it crossed a line that exploitation films were never supposed to reach. Salò, or The 120 Days of Sodom, 1975. Some films are controversial, others are considered unwatchable. Salò, or The 120 Days of Sodom, released in 1975, belongs firmly in the second category. Directed by Pier Paolo Pasolini, the film adapts the writings of the Marquis de Sade and places them within fascist Italy during the final days of World War II. A group of powerful officials kidnaps young victims and imprisons them inside a remote villa, where they impose a series of humiliating and degrading rituals. The story unfolds like a structured nightmare. Each chapter introduces new forms of psychological cruelty. Pasolini deliberately removed traditional storytelling comforts. There are no heroes, no rescues, and almost no hope. Everything about the film feels cold and controlled. The violence is presented calmly. Characters behave politely while committing horrific acts. The sterile environment makes the events feel disturbingly bureaucratic. Censors reacted immediately. The film was banned in numerous countries, seized by authorities, and removed from theaters shortly after its release. Even in places where it was later permitted, heavy restrictions limited who could see it. Adding to the film's dark legacy, Pasolini was murdered shortly before its premiere. Today, Salò remains one of the most debated films ever made. Some critics view it as a political allegory about power and corruption. Others argue it crossed a moral boundary cinema should never approach. Either way, censors knew immediately that this was not a movie they could easily control. The Driller Killer, 1979. By the late 1970s, Grindhouse cinema had already pushed violence to uncomfortable levels. Then, The Driller Killer arrived. Released in 1979, the film follows Reno Miller, a struggling artist living in a deteriorating New York apartment while desperately trying to finish a painting that could save his career. But his life begins collapsing. Bills pile up. His relationship deteriorates. A loud punk band rehearses endlessly in the apartment above him, filling every night with chaotic noise. The pressure builds slowly. Director Abel Ferrara shows Reno's mental state deteriorating piece by piece, financial stress, insomnia, and creative frustration gradually transforming into something far darker. Eventually, Reno snaps. Armed with a power drill, he begins wandering through the nighttime streets of Manhattan, attacking strangers in sudden bursts of violence. The film's gritty realism shocked audiences. Ferrara shot much of it on real New York streets during a period of urban decay, giving the story an unsettling documentary-like atmosphere. The controversy intensified in Britain during the early 1980s. The Driller Killer became one of the most infamous entries on the government's video nasties list, movies authorities believed were corrupting public morality. Police raids targeted video stores selling the film. Ironically, those raids only increased curiosity. The movie became a forbidden artifact of Grindhouse history, exactly the kind of film authorities seemed desperate to hide. Snuff, 1976. Few films have ever generated rumors as disturbing as Snuff. Released in 1976, the movie arrived surrounded by whispers that quickly spread through Grindhouse theaters and newspaper headlines. The marketing campaign made a shocking claim. The final scene supposedly showed a real murder captured on film. The movie itself follows a group of criminals hiding in South America after committing political assassinations. For most of its running time, it resembles a typical low-budget exploitation thriller. Then comes the ending. According to the film's promotion, the production suddenly breaks down while filming. The camera keeps rolling as the crew appears to commit a horrific act that was never meant to be staged. Audiences didn't know what to believe. Some viewers left theaters convinced they had witnessed an actual crime. Protest groups formed outside cinemas demanding the film be banned. Newspapers questioned whether filmmakers had crossed an unimaginable ethical line. Investigations later revealed that the infamous ending had been staged after the original film was completed, added purely as a marketing stunt. But by then, the legend had already taken hold. The controversy turned Snuff into one of the most notorious Grindhouse films ever released. Because the question that haunted audiences wasn't just about what they saw, it was about what they feared might be real. Grindhouse cinema didn't just challenge audiences. It challenged the idea that movies could be controlled at all. Every film on this list forced censors to confront a simple reality. The harder you try to bury controversial art, the more curious people become. And somewhere in the archives of forgotten theaters, there are still films considered too shocking to show today.